other dignitaries on of the dais, delegates from abroad, dear friends, I am extremely thankful to all of you for accepting our invitation to discuss one of the most important contemporary topics that is being discussed and debated world over for the last 2 years. In the intellectual discourses, policy discussions and political debates, the role, relevance and importance of state-owned enterprises and issues related to their governance has acquired a very significant place. The role of state-owned enterprises in the national economy as an effective tool to develop an egalitarian society had been always upheld till the advent of neoliberal capitalist ideology. In the newly liberated countries after the Second World War, they were the main driving forces to thrive the economy that was in shambles due to the long colonial rule. In such countries, they were largely dependent for designing a development plan aiming at self-reliance, growth, and for protecting the sovereignty. In many third world countries, the initial development of economy has mainly by large level public investments. This was welcomed by the capitalist classes also due to their inability to invest massively in the productive sectors as well as in the R&D sectors so as to develop new technologies. In both these areas, the investments came from the public exchequer. The core sectors were built up by utilizing sizable portion of the national income. In the advanced countries also, especially after the Great Depression of 1930s, there was an inclination towards public spending primarily for generation of employment, enlarging the purchase power of people, and to save the economy from imminent collapse. The trend of developing states, state-owned enterprises continued till 1970s as an alternative to the private capital. In the democratic politics, the sidelined masses were ensured of basic amenities through these organizations. But the neoliberal experiments that could bring in temporary boom in some countries started challenging the role of governments in the productive sectors and demanded the withdrawal of state machinery from economic activity. Initially, such demands did not attract many except some totalitarian governments. But the transnational monopoly capitalism was all set to release the economy from the control of state and social regulations. An intelligentsia class was developed in the very renowned institutions world over to provide intellectual inputs for debasing the egalitarian societies. The collapse of Soviet Union and the socialist bloc in the early 1990s strengthened the monopoly capitalism and neoliberal onslaught. The ideological alternatives became very weak, and the role of the state in the national economy was considerably diminished. The post-Soviet Union era witnessed a direct intervention of the multinational corporations in the productive sectors of third world countries at the auspices of Bretton Woods organizations in the name of Structural Adjustment Program. This was implemented in the pretext of reverberating the economies. Many third world countries affected with serious balance of payment crisis and fiscal deficit had no option other than accepting the conditionalities of the World Bank and the IMF for receiving financial support from them. One of the main conditions for providing loans was to reduce the role of state-owned enterprises in the national economy and to restructure them so as to make ways for the transnational corporations to intervene freely with the financial operations in the countries. The big domestic business houses, which found widened opportunities, also consented for such initiatives with the demand for level playing fields. If structural adjustment program in the third world countries paved ways for the neoliberal capitalist operations, wherein the role of the state-owned enterprises in the economy was minimized. In the developing countries, the same effects were taking place in different mode. In countries like United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and in the erstwhile socialist countries, where public sector organizations were controlling many crucial sectors, the government started withdrawing from such areas and allowed the private capital to play very important roles in those areas. Another important phenomenon during that period was the growth of the finance capital. The emergence of new generation science and technologies in the last decade of the 20th century boosted the service industries. With new avenues of investment, the enormous capital started flowing into that sector, and financial bubbles were getting developed. This did not last long. These bubbles were destined to burst soon, and the first shock to the neoliberals happened with the burst of dot-com bubbles in the initial years of this century. The burst of dot-com bubbles was metastasized with the housing bubble. The huge inflow of finance capital, along with the greed for unethical profits, compelled the financial institutions to provide lending without even verifying the repayment capacity of the borrowers. The withdrawal of the regulatory or enforcement authorities from supervising such activities has resulted in shadow banking systems that were controlling the major portion of the lending. The ultimate result was the rupture of the another bubble created by the neoliberal systems. The bursting of housing bubble in 2008 had serious impacts on the world economy. Even reputed banks and financial institutions were forced to file pauper suits. The industrial production diminished. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and the whole economy resisted. There was a virtual panic. Almost all developed countries declared bailout and stimulus packages. Trillions of US dollars were pumped to market to ensure liquidity. Despite the measures taken to salvage the economies of various nations, the impact of the meltdown continues. Consequent to the global financial crisis, there is a thinking against the unfettered capitalism. The role of the government and its agencies in the economy is again recognized. The relevance of state-owned enterprises in the productive and welfare sector is again acknowledged. It is in this background we have assembled here to discuss about the importance of state-owned enterprises. I would like to state that one aspect very categorically. At this juncture, we have to think not only about the role of public sector in the country, but also have to go in for introspection about the way they have been running. We should admit the fact that in many cases, the SOEs were poorly performed, not because they were owned by the state, but due to the issues related to their governance. The performance of the enterprises has a very less relation to the ownership structure. If they are properly managed and good governance principles are implemented, there is no reason for bad performance. This is the one fact that I want to emphasize. I am not denying the importance of the political stand of the governments and its transcendental status. But in a political setup where the state is entrusted to protect the SOEs, there must be a good governance practices. Unless these practices are adopted, even the political governments will not be a position to protect them in long term. This is what happened in Kerala. We have the largest number of state-owned enterprises due to various historical reasons. But I must admit that many of such enterprises were not properly managed. The essential elements of good governance was absent. I'm not talking about the utility services. Even many companies in the manufacturing sector were badly performing, and they were maintained and protected solely for political reasons. On 2 occasions, consultants were appointed to develop a strategy for the revival of the sector. But both the times, the advice was either to close down or privatize them. This is the area where the present government took certain concrete initiatives. When this government came to power in 2006, it was declared that the government would not privatize the state-owned enterprises, but would resort to such strategic initiatives to revive them. The policy initiatives and concerted efforts in this sector have proved fruitful. There is a remarkable turnaround. I will cite only one figure. In 2005-06, out of the total 42 PSUs under Industries Department, 30 were making losses. The total loss during that year was 70 crores rupees. But in 2009-10, this loss was transformed to a profit of rupees 240 crores. The number of loss-making companies has come down to 5. They also will be profitable in this financial year. I'm not going to the details of the initiatives taken by the government for the revival of the PSUs. A reading material is distributed with the details of such initiatives. With these words, I conclude. I wish for a meaningful discourses in the forthcoming technical sessions and expect to have more debates and discussions in the immediate future. I once again thank everyone and wish all of you a pleasant stay for 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to have Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram as our chief guest of the day. As pointed out in the welcome address, Dr. Sundaram is a prominent economist from Malaysia and is currently serving as a United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. He is on the board of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Geneva, and was one of the founders of the International Development Economic Associates. He is a leading scholar and expert in the political economy of development.
One very crucial component of this is to look for opportunities for state-owned enterprise reform, essentially as an alternative to privatization. And this has been well received, and it is in this context that my presence here, that I find myself here this morning. I think it's very important to recognize that the move towards privatization was always politically driven. It wasn't essentially driven by economic arguments, although there were claims that there was an economic consensus. For example, Larry Summers, at that time the Chief of International Affairs in the Treasury Department, claimed that privatization must be completed as soon as possible. This was, of course, in the context of the turnaround in the former Soviet Union and the encouragement which was being given by his administration to privatization in the United States. In the former Soviet Union. I won't go into the definitions of the privatization, but I think it's very important to recognize that there are many different phenomena involving ownership and sometimes not involving ownership, which are sometimes referred to as privatization. It is also important to recognize that the first thrust towards privatization in the 1980s took place in the context of 2 crises. Firstly, there was the international crisis precipitated by Paul Volcker, who was at that time the the chairman of the United States Federal Reserve Bank, where interest rates were raised to 26%. And this, of course, precipitated two types of crisis. Fiscal crisis for many governments, which were related in turn to debt crisis, particularly international debt crisis. And hence, following that, we find that many governments, particularly in developing countries, were compelled to undertake large-scale privatizations as part of policies which were promoted by the World Bank in particular, which were associated with what was called structural adjustment. Of course, sometimes many of these policies were associated with the IMF's stabilization programs as well, essentially for ideological reasons rather than pragmatic reasons, as I will try to show. The arguments for privatization, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Ostensibly, it is to reduce the burden of government, of the financial burden on government, and a number of other reasons, which I won't go into right now. But it is also suggested that public sector monopolies will be reduced by privatization. Although the simple transfer of ownership in and of itself does not eliminate any kind of monopoly situation, as you all know. It's very important for us to recognize that particularly during the 1980s and the 1990s, the emphasis in privatization policy was towards what is called mass privatization. In other words, the thrust towards privatization was always seen in very political terms. In order to ensure political support for privatization programs, it was seen as important that that the gains for privatization be spread among the public. This was done in various different ways. I'll just mention two. As you know, in the United Kingdom, Mrs. Thatcher sold off public housing at very heavily discounted rates. So working class people, among others, who were the beneficiaries of this, found themselves often converted to the ideology of privatization because of these short-term benefits. Another example would be the so-called voucher privatizations which took place in the former Soviet Union following from the 1990s. And this voucher privatization was recognized as inappropriate for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless was promoted precisely because it would give a stake in privatization to much of the public. As you all know, very shortly thereafter, this voucher privatization gave rise to the emergence of oligarchs, and these very oligarchs were the first to take their money out of the country. And as you know, many of the oligarchs are based in places like London and elsewhere and have not contributed in any significant fashion to capital accumulation in Russia itself. It is very important also to recognize that it was seen as crucial to eliminating the political base of, in the Russian case, of the former Communist Party. And it was also seen as urgent to rush privatization. To rush privatization, even if it was ill-considered, because it was recognized that there was a very short window of opportunity for pushing through these privatizations, which must be seized before resistance came about. Resistance, for example, through a coalition of the managers and the employees of the state-owned enterprises, or resistance from consumers or other members of the public. Now, more recently, however, there has been increasing recognition that privatization has forced many, many problems. And the successes associated with privatization are actually few and far between. Let me first begin with acknowledging some of the successes of privatization. Of the 32 or 33 privatizations undertaken by Mrs. Thatcher, it is now acknowledged that only one of them may be considered economically successful, and that is the privatization of National Freight, which was essentially a trucking company moving freight around the United Kingdom. And if you look at the careful studies of why that privatization was successful, it was mainly because it was an employee buyout. In other words, the employees of National Freight took over the management of National Freight, and they adjusted the incentive structure and the management situation in such a way as to be sensitive to the particular challenges facing freight haulage. And it was for that reason, and that reason primarily, that that National Freight was actually successfully privatized. All the other privatizations, and we know that now, in the United Kingdom, are considered to be economically failures by various criteria. In the former Soviet Union, there are very few examples of successful privatizations, but if we look at the World Bank's own studies, the World Bank would claim privatization in Hungary of about 3,000 small retail shops as being successful. And this again is not surprising. For retail trade to be organized in Hungary, it was extremely difficult, especially if you had very complex, centralized accounting systems. And it was when the retail shops were privatized and the proprietors themselves were largely responsible for their own bookkeeping that those enterprises were then deemed successful. In other words, there are very few cases of privatizations which have actually been successful by criteria which were established by the main promoters of privatization themselves. Also, it is now increasingly recognized that there are many, many successful examples of state-owned enterprises. In fact, the countries with the biggest sector of public sector are actually not socialist countries. The countries with the largest public sectors today are none other than Singapore, Israel, and Italy. And there are various reasons for this. And I think there are very few people who would argue that the state-owned enterprises in Singapore, for example, which is essentially a capitalist state, are any less than efficient. It is long being acknowledged during the 1990s that the most efficient steel plant in the world was POSCO, the Pohang Steel Corporation in the Republic of Korea or South Korea. And it has since been overtaken by Bao Steel in the suburbs of Shanghai, which is another state-owned enterprise. So what we basically see is that there is a great deal of acknowledgement throughout the world that state-owned enterprises can be well run, can be efficiently run even by capitalist criteria. And it is very important for us to recognize that the